Eric,
Hey, there he is.
how are you, brother?
I'm doing good, man. Wow, look at those books. That is impressive. I've only been here about a year, so my bookcase is still a work in progress. But that's impressive, man. Holy cow.
Thanks. You know what? It's the only thing I'm materialistic about, books and music.
That's incredible. Wow. I mean, those are all paperbacks, right? Holy cow.
Yeah, mostly a few hardbacks here and there, but a lot of it is through, because as a journalist, as a historian guy, every time I need to write about something, it's nice to have the sources here.
No, I totally feel you. So let me do the spiely stuff here off the top. So welcome to Make Your Own Fun. I'm here with Mike Sonksen, and I've known this guy for a long time. I was just thinking about this morning. I don't think I've seen you in person for probably 7 or 8 years. I know, you know, raising kids and all that stuff. It takes the time, but you got to put in the time. But I also wanted to say he is the author of I'm Alive in Los Angeles and Letters to My City, amongst other things. So I guess one of the first things I wanted to ask you off the top, it's kind of like a two-parter because it kind of goes together. So um, how were you exposed to local writers, and how did you start writing your own, poetry out of that? Did that come before or after?
That's a great question. And I've recently been writing about this. I just wrote a really long essay that's getting ready to post pretty soon about my somewhat of my own history in LA poetry, but also just about these open mics. And in the 90s, when I was at UCLA, I originally, I was writing poems in the dorms and, writing poems a little bit at the end of high school. And I started going to events, and I remember hearing advertisements for Casey on KCRW of Beyond Baroque. And, oh,
Oh,
Beyond
cool. Yeah.
Baroque. I remember seeing some little open mics around town, and of course we were into underground hip hop, but we were also into punk. And both hip hop and punk, there was a lot of poetry kind of present at the same time. So I mean, I remember I saw Rage Against the Machine my first year at UCLA when
Oh.
they weren't even, they were just becoming famous, but Zach was doing like this spoken word, and then the band would start, and you know, I, and so it was a very kind of a gradual thing. And I mean, I think I went to concerts and open mics and events for a good maybe 3 or 4 years before I ever read any of my own stuff in public, and I think I was about 22, 23 when I really started reading my own work. But before that, I was just a guy, I was a fan that was going to a million things. And I had wanted to originally go to graduate school in urban planning. So there's a reason why so many of my early poems are just all about LA and studying the city. And lately now, as you know, as a dad, I'm writing more somewhat about my kids and my family, and even thinking about my own parents and different things. But initially, it was sort of my um, involvement in the music scene and the art scene and the culture scene, and that's what was the catalyst.
So do you remember a time when one of your friends, just because there's that shift usually that happens with people when they're like about a teenager, when they go from either they get gifted a book or they get something from the library or something, and then to one of their buddies is like, hey, there's this thing going on. It's called an open mic, and like, man, we got to go check this out. Because it's like, I mean, you growing up in a larger city than me, you might have been exposed to that much younger. So it might have been like more of a commonplace, a normal thing. But I remember I was probably like mid-teens before, and I was always trying to like get in with like the college crowd, and it was just like, when
What
you're
did you?
a teenager, they don't want
What,
anything to do with you, but it's like, there's something going on, and it's just that person who has to kind of like open the door or say like, hey, you should come check this out.
yeah, there's a few things. And real quick, where did you grow up in Ohio again?
Kent.
Okay,
Yeah, Kent
that's where
State, all
Kent.
that jazz.
That's where Kent State is, huh?
Yeah, that's where I went to college too.
No, and man, I want to say I'm going to answer your question, but I was going to say I was also reading this about time, and
Wow,
I
that's great, man.
I appreciate your honest poetics, whether it be the poem for your daughter or
Mhm.
just your kind of your statement of purpose in a way about just why you do what you do, and so it really comes across well here.
Well, man, that really that means a lot. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you got it. No, and a couple of things, I guess. Sometimes we have people that believe in us before we believe in ourselves.
Hmm. For
And
sure. Yeah.
I had a few friends. My buddy Phil, his name is Philip Martin, aka Phil Harmonic, and he now lives on the East Coast. But we did poetry together for 15 years. But basically, he was an all-star soccer player at UCLA, and we lived in the dorms together.
Hmm.
But one day, I was writing a poem in my dorm, and we used to go to the apartment parties and hang out and everything. And but he was a jock, but he's a very versatile guy because people, you would have just thought he was this all-American soccer player. But he's, oh, you write poems too? And I was, oh, just a little bit. I mean, it wasn't anything that showed to anybody or anything. It was just, being 19 years old, 18, 19 years old. And so he and I would listen to hip hop and write sometimes and just kind of, but in when I was my senior year of UCLA, I got a buddy named Tyler who's a journalist, and he's more of a scholar, but he wrote some poems too. Uh, Tyler was in this writing class with me, and he was talking about this open mic, and there was this open mic at the Westwood Brewing Company, and it was called the House of Green, and it was actually also where I met Chiwan Choi. But there was this guy named John Kinney, aka Ordell Cordova, and John Kinney hosted this open mic that would have heavy metal bands, singer songwriters, comedians, rappers, poets, and it was really eclectic. And everybody would be drinking beer, and about half the crowd would be into it, and half the crowd wouldn't. It was one of those kind of very chaotic space.
Because everybody's just there to see their friend and their band or their singer or the poet or the comedian, right?
Pretty much, yeah. And then there was like, maybe it was like, because it was 3 blocks from UCLA, maybe it was like 60-70% UCLA. But then it was also a pretty live venue. So there was also some comedian or some poet or somebody that heard, oh, there's this dynamic space. And so Phil and I started going to that, and we went up pretty quickly, and then before you know it, we were there every week. And then little by little, people were like, oh, there's an open mic at the Onyx, and then, oh, there's these guys in Hollywood doing this thing. And I had gone to Beyond Baroque and bought books there. And so it was about 97, 98, and by about 99, 2000, we were all over the place. But I mean, I went to things as early as 93, 90, even 92, but 93, 94, 95, 96, in between going to college, I was going to a lot of things and just kind of
Soaking it up, taking it
looking
in.
up. Yeah.
So that brings me to another question because I remember how terrified I was my first experience. Do you remember your first experience at an open mic, getting up there with your like loose leaf paper? And I mean, I don't know if it was similar to kind of like kids talk about being in middle school and reading the open book report, in front of the class. So I don't know if you friends had read your stuff, or you just yourself was like, you know what, I've seen that, I've seen it, I've seen it, I've seen it, I just want to do it. Do you remember that experience at all?
Gosh, I guess so, like the Westwood Brewing Company one was maybe like the first official one, but before that, like we had done some like little apartment parties and backyard parties, and there was this thing that might have been my unofficial first time. Was my buddy had a place in Culver City, and he had a basement, and we used to do this really underground thing called Underwords, and it was like, and it was sort of poets and painters, so it was like half art show, half poetry. And so the first time at the Westwood Brewing Company in front of the drunk crowd, I do remember being kind of extra nervous and kind of And I had actually had two poems published in this UCLA Urban Planning Journal, and they
Wow.
and it was this journal was all these academic essays, and my poems were the only poems published in this thing. And at the time, I was the only undergraduate ever published in it. Later on, they published undergraduates, but it was these two poems I had sort of written about the LA riots and all these things, and they published. And so when I read at the Westwood Brewing Company, those poems had just been published, and I was about to graduate, and I think I had just turned 23 or something. But around 21, 22, we had started to do the somebody's apartment party in Venice, or like West LA or something, and so like those were like the informal transition, and then the more
In a way, that's great because it sounds like you kind of had a groundswell and support for your work. So the transition to a stage and a microphone and a spotlight, it doesn't sound like it was jarring for a lot of people to kind of get up there and be like, "Oh man, I'm around strangers. This is gonna suck."
Yeah, and there was a few of us. It was my buddy Phil, and then as I said, my friend Tyler. He was really he wrote poems too, but he was more of a kind of an academic journalist scholar guy. But there was a lot of us, and I think we were. It's funny. We thought we were reinventing the wheel, and then later on we find out, hey, there's all these other poets and all these other folks. But at the time when you're getting ready to graduate from school, and a lot of the people are trying to get a corporate job, and we were like, F that. I was maybe a little too bohemian for my own good, or it's all good. I've kind of reconciled it and kind of found a halfway point now. But at the time, there was moments where later on I realized, we were so underground for so long that you wake up and you're 40.
But I mean, like going back to an earlier point that you made, which I think is so important, is especially with younger people when they're getting into whatever it is, writing, painting, music. You don't have to really feel like you're inventing the wheel, but as long as it's like new and fresh and exciting for you, I mean, who knows what somebody is doing in Seattle or Miami or New York or Chicago right now. It's like they're going to be doing their own thing, and that's why it's so important to nurture young talent and just like, man, just be you. Just like, it's so hard when you're that age, I think, to feel like, well, I don't want to just talk about me, that's boring, I want to talk about people watching or this or that. I'm like, yeah, but only you were going through this life with your eyes and like your experiences. And so yeah, I just wanted to speak on that because I think that that's so important. I know in you as an educator too, I'm sure you've had those impressions with younger people and trying to like inspire.
You know what? I always say this, and I know you probably relate with me on this. Parenting and teaching helped me become a lot more whole, and even I think not only deepen the writing, but it made me think about the long haul. And writing is a long game, and it's a long journey, and so everywhere I teach, I've used the open mic format, and so much of my teaching philosophy has been influenced by hosting a million open mics, and so I do a lot of in-class writing with students, and we've been hosting an open mic at Woodbury University where I teach for the last three and a half years. And as I said, everywhere I've ever taught, I would host an open mic. But what I like about seeing the young people, I love it when you see the light bulb go on, you see the birth of a poet, or you see a kid writes a good poem and they said, hey, you know what? And sometimes the kid who writes the good poem might not have been the all-star on other things. And so, I mean, they might be too, but sometimes that kid writes a poem, and it becomes their lane, and everybody's looking for their own lane. And I think what I love about poetry and writing is that it gives people space to find their own lane. And
Right.
I love to see it when young people start to develop their worldview, and the poetry is a great place to explore. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. In fact, I'm glad that the when I started doing stuff, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, I never encountered or took seriously anybody that said it has to be a certain way, or a certain length or certain language or structure or style, because I feel like there was other than like the Beat Generation, there was this other classicist thing where people are just so rigidly stuck to the dogma of a short story or a book or a poem or short film or whatever, or a painting has to be this way and fit into this format. And I'm not saying it has to be like E.E. Cummings where it's like you can hold the page back and it's like you get something else out of it too. But I think you and I have that kind of similar, I think, view of, but especially when it comes to poetry, maybe not all the forms of writing, but the poem is just going to be whatever it's going to be. And what I've learned is like it's tough, but you got to get yourself out of your own way. Like you just have to let it happen.
Yes, sir. You're so right. And writing out of the heart. And then it's funny because later on, I right after my daughter was born, I did go to grad school and I did like transition. But like even as I learned formal styles of poetry, I still always not only liked free verse, but I like the rawness and like if you can somehow, and sometimes you can put a little rawness in some formal poetry, but I mean, I think there's nothing that beats just straight heart and sentiment. And I know T.S. Eliot and some of the new critics and all these folks, they thought emotion in poetry was taboo, but I prefer it. I mean, uh, I prefer hearing where people are and what they think and what they feel. And I think, is the younger generation that's right after you and I that are in their 20s and 30s now. And, you've heard that poetry books are selling better than ever, right? Have you heard that?
Yeah, to me, that's flabbergasting. Like, what's a good example? I think just the other day, I don't know, I was like at a Target or something buying light bulbs, the typical Saturday dad crap or whatever. And I'm like, the lines were long, and I'm like, I'm gonna go kill some time, and I'm gonna go in the book section or the media section or whatever. And I saw like 6 or 7 different poetry books, and I went, in a Target? Like, does this happen? Like, because usually they're all about, only novels, whatever, like the top 10 bestsellers on the New York Times. It's like you go to a grocery store and sometimes they have the old spindle racks. And again, it's like your top 10 best-selling novel writers, but almost never, I mean, almost never poetry books. So when I saw that, I was like, so something is happening, and another conversation I had with a few other poets too, and maybe you'll piggyback on this, is I'm actually seeing the comeback of chapbooks, of people doing it themselves, of like, hey, I'm not going to wait for the multi-million-dollar poetry publishing company or whatever to come to me. Like, no one knows me. I got to get my stuff out there. Social media too. I mean,
you're so right about the chapbooks. I mean, in 1998, my buddy Phil and I did our first chapbooks, and I'd say from about 98 to 2002, 2003, we both did 6, 7 chapbooks, and then a couple times we did a little like anthology of about 5 or 6 poets, and we did all these little different things. And the chapbooks are fun, and it was in that Kinko's, and now it's called FedEx.
Did
right?
you do the 9 by 12 page where you fold it and then staple it and then do your own artwork?
Yeah, man, we did all of that, man. Yeah, I mean, and it was fun, and those were, and sometimes you sell them at the readings.
Yeah. I love that, and it's like, a few years ago, I can't remember the last time I went to a reading before, the lockdown or whatever, but I just didn't see it. I didn't feel like there was the college crowd or whoever were like the bulk of the audience. They weren't I don't know, into the craft of making it themselves. And then I don't know if it's because lockdown and people were forced to face themselves and promote themselves, but now I'm seeing this huge uptick in people doing themselves. Like Kelsey Bryan Zwick does like little tiny books, and each one's like a poem, and it's just like, you know what, you're going to remember that even though she has a book on a Moontide Press, I'm still going to think about her doing her little tiny, almost like origami books because it's like people do it, but I hadn't seen it before. I was like, I'm gonna remember that because
Craft, man, and it is art. It's artwork, and it's handmade, and it's um and it also, there's a lot of people. This woman that's one of the best-selling poets in the world right now, that Rupi Kaur.
yeah,
I think her first book was self-published, and then it did so well that she got picked up. But like, even just the little handmade chapbooks and those things, that's a piece of art, and it's some craftsmanship, and
oh
people.
yeah, and it goes for every level of writing too. One of my favorite authors from the last few years is Andy Weir, and he self-published the Martian, and he just got a picture of somebody doing astronaut maneuvers in the desert, public domain, slapped it on there, and then it's just, enough people start talking about it. It's that grassroots thing. It's
Yeah.
coming back. So let me ask you this, because I know you do academic writing as well as creative writing. So when you're working on a project, do you know instinctively, like, this is only going to be for the page? Like, this is something I would never take on a stage and read in front of I mean, to use that old Andy Kaufman joke about reading The Great Gatsby on stage, like, you would never do that. You know what I mean? So do you know instinctively, or is it kind of just all one thing? Or because I know that you talk about, and I think that you just had an article published, if I'm right, about the biking trail trip.
Yes, 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 yes.
Okay, I didn't get a chance to read it, but yeah, so it's like, okay, you're just alive and you're doing your thing in your day with your friends or whatever, but at some point something, I call it the lightning zygote, kind of lands in your head and you're like, this could be something.
It's funny because I love to write essays as much as I love to write poems. And this one essay I just finished was 9,000 words, and
Wow.
that bike riding essay was about 3,000 words. And in the bike riding essay, I was revisiting the San Gabriel River biking trail that I used to bike as a kid in the 80s. And my grandfather and I used to bike it. And he lived in
Wow.
Long Beach. And it was a real seminal memory of my childhood. And there's a group called the Watershed Conservation Authority. And they had read one of my essays I'd written about the LA River years ago. And they said, hey, well, we're trying to do some work around the San Gabriel River, and we know you grew up near there. Would you want to write something about it? I said, you know what, I could write about the bike trail that I used to ride on there. And now it's funny because I have gotten to the point where one of my next books is going to be just all essays. There might be one poem in there, but it's going to be all essays. And what I may do on some of those is I might read a paragraph or two from the essay.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that for like promotion, like, what do you do, in terms of getting it out there?
Well, like, for example, there's a place on the San Gabriel River Trail where it goes through the Los Cerritos wetlands. In the Los
Okay.
Cerritos wetlands, a lot of the southern part of Long Beach used to be all wetlands, but I literally 95% of the wetlands are gone now. Now there's shopping malls and tract houses on all the wetlands, and a lot of, it's funny, a lot of LA County was wetlands. A lot of people don't know this. Beverly Hills, La Cienega in Spanish means the swamp. So, I mean, there's all these little, but anyway, in the Los Cerritos wetlands, there's this place where there's a couple of grandfather oil wells. Like, there's oil in the wetlands. And so there's like a little bit of the wetlands remaining, but then there's these oil wells, and then the riverbed, and then there's a place where the river goes from the concrete channel into the soft bottom. And of course, it was originally all soft bottom, but they put the river in concrete because of the floods that happened in the 20s and the 30s. When LA used to have a lot of rain, it would flood through these rivers. But so like, if I were to, I might read that paragraph where I'm talking about the imagery of the oil wells and the wetlands, and this sort of man versus nature dichotomy thing that happens there. And then maybe what I would do is maybe be in conversation with somebody about the San Gabriel River or something. And but I do love writing these essays. And there's a famous Yeats quote that I always say. Yeats, he said that When you're writing a poem, you're having an argument with yourself. When you're writing an essay, you're having an argument with the world.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. My thing I always say is poetry for me is about chasing down a feeling,
Mhm.
and stories and scripts, and that to me is more about just telling a story.
Yes, sir.
Just
Yes.
it's that continuation of sitting around the campfire our ancestors did and passing along like lessons, Greek mythology, all that kind of stuff.
I like what you said about chasing down a feeling. I like that. That's right. That's right.
Because I mean, I don't know if you run into this too, but the older I get, with the more distractions I get, I don't feel like I'm writing the quantity of poetry I used to.
Right.
But now when I do, I'm able to, turn my ringer off on my phone and lock the door, and
Yeah.
I can be like laser focused, and I might have like 5, 6, 7 ideas and go like, okay, today it's this one, and
Yes.
then knock it out in 50, 20, 30 minutes, at least as a rough draft. Because
Yeah.
it's like, man, there's times, and I know you've been there too, where you're sitting across the table from somebody at a cafe or a bar, and you're talking, all of a sudden you get the idea, and you just and
Yeah.
you're like, well, and then you're like, the person's like, are you having a stroke? Are you okay? Like, I need to, and you're like trying to flag down the waiter, like, I need a pen, like anyone,
Yeah, man.
we've been there.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So let me ask you this. So, as an educator, do you feel it's harder or getting easier to get kids interested in history? I think we have a lot more tools with the internet and things like that, YouTube or whatever, to put people in their the right frame of mind of stuff. Um,
You
but
know,
I know that so much about LA, but and just in terms of like the larger world, it's so hard to pry a kid away from a phone when they have everything at their fingertips, and you're trying to teach them this one little thing that they're trying to learn in their lesson that week.
you know what? Thank you for that asking that question, Eric, because I'm actually writing a poem about that right now.
Wow.
And but not only that, but I did a presentation 2 months ago for the California Association of English Teachers, and I did this talk on how my teaching is very interdisciplinary. So I've been teaching these classes that are sort of half history, half English, and at Woodbury University, and they're mostly 100 level, 101, 102, 103, 104. But like I taught a class called Journeys, and the Journeys class. Then last semester I taught a class called Natures, and the Natures class is sort of this somewhat environmental science, but it's also human nature. And there's a little bit of social psychology in there and a little bit of local history and all of these things. But there's a quote from this author that I love, James W. Lowen. And his quote is emotion is the glue that makes history stick.
Very good.
And so my philosophy for teaching history is that I start with having students write a little bit of their own history.
Ah.
And so what I do there, I mean, there's a couple of favorite assignments I have, and I'm not the only one who does these assignments. I think there's a whole lot of us that do these, but I might have them write an oral history, write down a story that was told to you by your grandmother, your grandfather, your aunt, your uncle, your dad, your mom. Is there a famous story in your family about how your parents met, or is there something memorable that you've heard your whole life, or and even if it's just 2, 3 pages. And so I have students write down. So I have a whole series of assignments that's around this. Another assignment I have is a mapping assignment, and I have them do a deep map of either their childhood home, the neighborhood they grew up in. Is there a place where something happened to you? And so they'll draw a map. But then also maybe I had a kid do, this is the restaurant my parents met at, or this is the library I used to go to all the time. Or, I used to play baseball in high school. This is the field where one day I went 4 for 4 or something. But I'll have them draw a little map, and then they'll either write a poem or a short essay about that place. And so I love history, but what I do to hook them, and I know I'm not the only one who does this, but as I have them writing about their own history, and then I say, okay, well, you're a part of this larger history. You're a part of if you're though even though you're writing about Woodland Hills or you're writing about Granada Hills, you're a part of the history of the San Fernando Valley.
Right.
Or this kid, I had a kid who was from East LA, and she was writing about going with her grandmother to the famous place where they had all of the carne asada and where they had the tortillas and the whole thing. And I was like, well, that's a local history.
That's really great, man. I applaud you for that. I mean, anything to make it interesting and exciting. So basically, it's like you make it personal for them, and then you can make history personal for them too. So that's really great. So I know you've traveled outside of the city and promoted your work and done shows. And one thing, because at least of the two books that I know about from you, are very Los Angeles centric. So I was curious, like when you do go, to another city or another state, and you're doing a show, how does the LA themed work go down outside of Los Angeles, because they're not going to have the same experiences as you? I mean, on a certain level, I mean, life experiences they will, but so much of your stuff is about Los Angeles. So
That's a great question, because I've done two different approaches with that. I have a fair amount of poems that were just about music or this or that. So I've gone sometimes to places, because I've done a bunch of poetry events in San Francisco, for example. And so then there's a California thing or something. So, I mean, a lot of my early work was all geography and history. It's been kind of branching out more lately, but I've also done LA poems in other places, and somebody inevitably would come up and be like, what, actually, I've been in Chicago for 5 years now, but I grew up in North Hollywood or something. So sometimes I've done that. And there are some, I was talking to one of my mentors about this. She was saying there's this whole idea of micro to macro, and sometimes by you zeroing in on your own micro environment, you kind of give people permission to write about theirs, and so, but it's funny because there's some of the next things I'm writing might not be so LA, but I started with LA, even I guess in the way of my own teaching philosophy with the students. I kind of excavated my own world around me as I started to understand that. Then it kind of gave me a better command of writing about the world at large. And as I said, I was so into urban planning and urbanism and kind of I was a sociology undergraduate, and then my master's I ended up getting one in English and history. But I've always loved the liberal arts, and so some of what one of my biggest projects and the things I'm interested in is I would like to encourage people to write their own stories about their neighborhoods, and like I'd love to hear your Ohio poems, man. And the Fireflies, and
yeah, they're coming. I'm working on stuff, so you'll see that eventually.
those stories are killer, and you'll give us a slice of America.
Yeah, that's the heartland there. Got a few minutes here. I just want to ask a few more things. So what do you, I mean, I know we talked about this and you brought it up earlier, the influence of hip hop on poetry. And I believe it was Bob Dylan talking about NWA when people were asking him in the 80s about, songwriters at that time and poets and things. And people would say, oh, you're, a poet of your generation and blah, 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 and he's like, man, I'm not a poet. He's like, I write 4-minute songs. Like NWA, those guys are poets. Those guys are walking around on the street, seeing it, writing it down on paper, and getting the word out there.
There's that famous quote from Chuck D of Public Enemy that he called hip hop the CNN of the streets.
It's true.
And very much so, the hip hop lyricists and the early, was a very early hip hop song. What is it? Don't push me because I'm close to the edge, and talking about New York.
Yeah.
As hip hop started in New York, it was the street reporters just talking about the disinvestment of the Bronx in the mid 70s and everything that was happening. But on that same note, we were talking about punk. Zach De La Roca was from Rage Against the Machine was kind of equally hip hop and punk. And he was kind of rapping, but he was kind of singing, and so I think hip hop and also singer-songwriters. Kendrick Lamar won the Pulitzer Prize,
Yeah,
and
that's why. Whew, that
some,
guy's amazing.
somebody said that, giving it to Kendrick, he deserves it and he's great, but somebody was saying giving it to him also was like their acknowledgement of like sleeping on hip hop for the last 30 years,
Yeah,
so,
that's true. Yeah.
but it's interesting because even I know they were kind of playful and kind of silly, but Bradley from Sublime was like this reggae, punk, hip hop. And I know he could be kind of irreverent, but like his song about the 92 riots, and he talked about, April 26, 1992,
Yeah.
and um, I
Yeah, I
think,
never doubted that that guy lived through stuff. Like, I know he had a really rough emotional turmoil life, but like listening to his stuff, it's like I never doubted for a second that he was like posturing or it was like forced. I really feel like, maybe he did, not want to judge his mom for doing crack or whatever. I don't know, but it's like you really felt like he wasn't like, wink, smile, like this is a funny thing. Like, no, man, this is my Tuesday.
he was a Long Beach. I mean, really, Long Beach is a really diverse place, and he went to Wilson High School in the middle of the city, and I think his dad was a contractor, and so like he spoke a little bit of Spanish, but I heard some of it was he used to sometimes work for his dad in the summer, and he liked drinking beers with the dudes that worked for his dad. And he's sitting there talking about Sancho's,
So he knew what was up. Yeah.
and a buddy of mine who's Mexican was like, Bradley's Spanish wasn't really that good, but we still loved him because he tried.
Yeah. I mean, if anybody's just going to be honest and have their heart on their sleeve and just be themselves and not judge other people, like I'm a big believer in do whatever you want. It's not as long as you're not hurting yourself or other people. So if he's just being real and hanging out, that's cool.
Yeah, yeah. And so I mean, I love hip hop and also lyrics, period. Like they're just musicians, musicians writing lyrics are lyricism in poetry is very much the same. I mean, maybe a longer poem is a little wordier, but
Right.
the core is there's a thread that connects them for sure.
Oh yeah, and like I said, a lot of this goes back to our ancestors just sitting around a fire, and sometimes it's like half the tribe goes off and hunts something, and the other half goes off and gets the berries and the water and the stuff. But it's like they don't meet again until the evening meal, and like the stories they have to tell about what they encountered during the day, and that's kind of what that is. Like we were talking about, it doesn't matter if it's Sugar Hill Gang, it doesn't matter if it's the Clash. It's just like everybody's got their own thing. But yeah,
Sure.
man, I hate to say it, we're going to wrap it up here. But I wanted to give you a little bit of time here to kind of just kind of say, where people can find your stuff, website, YouTube. Just give you a couple seconds there to do
Yeah.
that.
Thank you, Eric. Yeah, my most recent book, Letters to My City, is online. You know, it's on Amazon and all of that. And a few of the local bookstores around Southern California. But also, I have a lot of articles on KCT, LA Taco. I have a lot of journalism online. I just did a piece for Alta magazine. There's the pieces I just did for the Watershed Conservation Authority, and so also I did an essay recently for Angel's Flight, and so I'm always, I try to publish a piece a month. Some months more than others, but there's
You're a
always
prolific guy, man. I gotta say, wow. It's like every once in a while, I'm like, man, another one from Mike.
Oh, thanks, Eric. Well, man, you know what? And also, I love the events too, and we'll be hosting some more events. We're getting back to being in public now,
Oh, cool.
little by little by little. But most of all, I would say, poetry has even become my social life. I love the community, jamming with folks like you and just seeing people and hearing everyone. And so I really found my own identity in the poetry scene. Like a lot of who I am is from being in the literary scene. And it made me an educator and even a dad. So here's to writing and good people, bro.
Thank you so much, man. Thank you for being on the show. And I'm looking forward to the book of essays. And I mean, I'll hopefully see you around town sometime soon. Get out to an open mic.
Thanks for all you do, Eric. And as you said, it's about effing time, baby.
Thanks, man. Have a great weekend.
Brother, thank you, Eric. Nice to see you, man. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Take care.